Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Young Lords, A Radical History by Johanna Fernández, narrated by Joana Garcia. Introduction. In the final days of 1969, the Young Lords were on top of the world. As the decade entered its midnight hour, this group of poor and working-class Puerto Rican radicals brought an alternative vision of society to life in their own neighborhood. Their aim was to reclaim the dignity of the racially oppressed and elevate basic human needs: food, clothing, housing, health, work, and community over the pursuit of profit. In the course of a fight with East Harlem's First Spanish United Methodist Church, FSUMC, they found an unlikely but irresistible setting for the public presentation of their revolutionary project. The Young Lords had simply been looking for a space to feed breakfast to poor children before school. The church seemed an ideal place. It was conveniently situated in the center of East Harlem and housed in a beautiful, spacious building that was closed all week, except for a couple of hours on Sunday. But its priest, an exile of Castro's revolutionary Cuba, denied the use of its building. In response, the Young Lords charged that the church's benign indifference to the social and economic suffering of the people of East Harlem, one of the poorest districts in the city, mirrored government indifference and enabled social violence. They argued further that the church's professed goals of service to mankind and promises of happiness and freedom from earthly worries in the hereafter cloaked a broader project of social control. 2 months after their initial request was denied, the militant activists nailed the doors of the FSUMC shut after Sunday service and barricaded themselves inside. In that moment, their neighborhood deployment of the building takeover, a strategy popularized by 60s radicals in universities, gave concrete expression to growing calls for community control of local institutions in poor urban neighborhoods. In their determination to stoke revolution among Puerto Ricans and other poor communities of color, these radicals transformed the occupied building into a staging ground for their vision of a just society. Rechristened the People's Church by the Young Lords, the liberated space was offered up as a sanctuary for East Harlem's poor. Before long, community residents poured into the church in search of solutions to all manner of grievances, from housing evictions to the absence of English translation at parent-teacher meetings. The Lords served hot meals to school-aged children, helping to institutionalize what is now a federal program that serves school breakfast to children, and ran a free medical clinic for members of the community. They sponsored a vigorous political education program for anyone who was interested, where they taught classes in Puerto Rican and Black American history, the history of the national independence movement of Puerto Rico, and current events, an alternative to public school curricula that failed to make sense of the troubles of the poor and the brown in New York City. In the evenings, the Lords hosted festivals of the oppressed, where they curated spurned elements of Puerto Rican culture and music, performed by underground poets, musicians, artists, and writers. An antidote to the erasure of Puerto Rican culture and history that accompanied the U.S. colonial project that began in Puerto Rico in 1898. New genres of cultural expression were cultivated at the Liberated Church, among them the spoken-word poetry jam, which would in the coming years become a springboard for the development of hip-hop. In the process, the Young Lords created a counter-narrative to post-war media representations of Puerto Ricans as junkies, knife-wielding thugs, and welfare dependence that replaced traditional stereotypes with powerful images of eloquent, strategic, and candid Puerto Rican resistance. At a moment of growing state violence against activists, the decision of these radicals to turn the Lord's house into a site of protest was a brilliant tactical move that created a strategic sanctuary from the possibility of violent reprisals. Approximately 1 year earlier, in April 1968, after hundreds of Columbia University students occupied major campus buildings in protest of the Vietnam War and the university's gentrification of Harlem, students were dragged out of the occupied buildings by police with billy clubs. At the church in East Harlem, such violence was politically untenable. Immediately, local grandmothers began delivering pots of food to the Puerto Rican radicals through church windows, while a phalanx of National Lawyers Guild attorneys on site and in the church's periphery filed court injunctions and reminded judges and police of the barricaded radicals' constitutionally protected right to protest. Teetering between sacrilege and righteousness, the young lords' unfolding drama was captured by TV cameras parked in and outside the house of worship. As the young lords fortified their programs at the church, hundreds of supporters and engrossed spectators gathered to hear about new developments during their daily press conferences. Speaking through a bullhorn out of a church window to attentive journalists outside, young Lord Iris Benitez explained, "The people of El Barrio have gotten to the point that they don't ask the why of things anymore. They just see things as they exist and try to survive. The young lords know the why, and we're trying to relay that information to the people." From their pulpit at the People's Church, the young lords observed that the poverty indices of Puerto Rico, a U.S. colony, and this Puerto Rican neighborhood were strikingly similar. Another young lord referenced the global scope of resistance a year earlier, when millions of people rose up in Rome, Madrid, Paris, Belgrade, Prague, Mexico City, Pakistan, Chicago, across U.S. cities and beyond. Pablo Guzman observed, "It ain't just y'all in this church. It ain't just East Harlem. We relate to an international struggle. It may sound ridiculous, but this all links up, from Vietnam to Puerto Rico to Watts." Born in the wake of one of the deepest political radicalizations of the century, the young lords' creative militancy, critique of social problems spoken in the language of their peers, and socialist vision for America embodied the best of 60s radicalism. Against the backdrop of America's escalating 60s urban rebellions, the young lords unleashed a chain of urban guerrilla protests that amplified the primacy of class analysis and revolution in the fight against racism. From garbage dumping demonstrations to a series of church and hospital occupations, termed offensives in deference to the Tet campaign of the Vietnamese, this small group exploded into the country's consciousness in July 1969, staging their social grievances with infectious irreverence and distinctive imagination. Although a new wave of repression befell the movement, the young lords actually benefited from protests in defense of the Panther 21, jailed that same year. The arrests had been part of a police frame-up. With New York's police department exposed and discredited, the new radicals were able to launch their campaigns without the same level of disruption that the FBI and local law enforcement brought against the Black Panthers in the late 1960s. Over the course of their brief yet productive lifespan, the young lords won significant reforms and used local battles to expose the United States' quiet, imperial project in Puerto Rico, which became a colony of the United States in 1898. In just a few short years, the group grew from a little-known organization to the stuff of legend. In the process, their media-conscious urban guerrilla offensives, combined with the group's multi-ethnic membership, redefined the character of protest, the color of politics, and the cadence of popular culture in the city. And as the children of the vast post-World War II transfer of Puerto Ricans to the U.S. mainland, the young lords also helped their generation interpret the causes of that migration and the place of Puerto Ricans in U.S. society as special citizens and a diaspora of colonial people living in the metropole. Between 1947 and 1970, 1/3 of the people of Puerto Rico left the island. Most settled in New York, where Puerto Ricans migrated in larger numbers than Black Americans during the same period. By 1970, the Puerto Rican population on the U.S. mainland had grown 500 times to approximately 1.5 million. Puerto Rican post-war migration formed part of a much larger migratory process that transformed the class structure and political standing of groups that have been historically racialized and concentrated in the most backward and exploitative sectors of the economy, namely Black Americans, Mexicans, and Native Americans. The vast internal migration of people of color from countryside to city during and after World War II proletarianized these previously rural and small-town people, which increased their economic power. Urbanization gave them a sense of their strength in numbers, amplified their potential political power, and established the conditions for the rise of the civil rights movement. The timing of Puerto Rican migration set the stage for the emergence of a group like the Young Lords in the 1960s, whose members were largely first- and second-generation working-class Puerto Rican migrants between the ages of 14 and 34. Most were in their late teens. The post-war migration of Puerto Ricans to the U.S. mainland was exponentially larger than in previous generations. The young were overrepresented in its ranks, and their consciousness would be shaped by an unlikely combination of politicizing experiences from the rise of the civil rights, Black Power, women's and gay liberation movements, and the U.S. declaration of war in Vietnam, to their own experience in an urban setting beset for the first time by industrial decline, permanent unemployment, and the growing spatial and economic isolation of its racialized residents. Like their Black American counterparts in the 60s movements, the Young Lords became iconic among Puerto Ricans and within movement circles for several reasons. Their uncompromising militancy matched and channeled the anger unleashed by the era's urban rebellions. At a moment when the call for revolution began to replace the call for reform in the minds of many, the Young Lords linked the precarious conditions of post-war Puerto Rican migrants to their status as colonial subjects, identified common cause with Black Americans, and called for socialism. And in their quest to take a stand in the city, the Young Lords discovered and asserted in the public square what it meant to be Puerto Rican in America. Children of the Revolution. As the mainstream and underground 60s press captured the controlled chaos at the People's Church, an evocative portrait of the racial and ethnic composition of the protagonists struck a chord with people around the world. Unintentionally, the Young Lords had staged a visual coup. New York's major Spanish-language newspaper, El Diario La Prensa, took special notice. These young men and women, Puerto Ricans, some white and others of the black race, and among them some Americans, love the ideal of independence for Puerto Rico. They say that they form part of a coalition with the Black Panther Party and the Young Patriots. Although the Young Lords were self-professed Puerto Rican revolutionary nationalists, approximately 25% of its members were Black Americans. The group's membership gave political expression to the common social, economic, and cultural urban experience of Puerto Rican and Black American youth who grew up alongside each other in the 1950s and 1960s. Considered New York's Puerto Rican barrio, East Harlem was in fact home to Puerto Ricans, Black Americans, and white Americans of Italian descent. One of the city's few multiracial and multi-ethnic neighborhoods. In 1960, 40.4% of its residents were Puerto Rican, 38.2% Black American, and 21.4% white American. With another 5% of its members composed of non-Puerto Rican Latinxes, the group's membership also reflected the changing demographic character and diverse ethnic composition of a city increasingly populated by people of color. The ethnic and racial diversity on display at the church seemed to express the possibilities for a society free from bigotry, of the kind that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. imagined in his notion of the beloved community, the same kind that seemed ever more in doubt as riots crept across America's cities toward the end of the 1960s. But the Young Lords envisioned even more. Only a decade removed from the anti-communist witch hunts of the 1950s, the Young Lords, together with a significant minority of young organizers of their generation, began to embrace revolutionary politics. This vision of the political and economic organization of society was radically opposed to standard American political values. The Young Lords' calls for Puerto Rican independence, an end to hunger and want, and a socialist society embodied the politics of the era's revolutions for independence from European colonial rule that swept through Africa, Asia, and Latin America after World War II. In the United States, self-proclaimed revolutionaries of color linked racism to colonialism and class exploitation under capitalism and identified all as barriers to building a liberated society. Organizationally, the Young Lords modeled themselves after the Black Panthers, who called for the building of vanguard revolutionary parties by Black Americans and other people of color as vehicles through which those who believed that the system must be dismantled would come together to concentrate and coordinate their efforts. The Lords outlined their bold vision for a just society in a 13-point program and platform in which they called for self-determination for Puerto Ricans and proclaimed, "We want a socialist society." Through community-based campaigns and political propaganda, the Young Lords popularized the demand for Puerto Rican independence both in their own constituency and within broader movement circles. They also spread and demystified socialist ideas among poor and working-class people of color, arguing that society should be organized around human priorities and needs rather than capitalism's drive for profit. Like the Black Panthers, the Young Lords believed that the fight against racism and colonial domination was central, rather than secondary, to the fight for a new socialist society. For this reason, they called themselves revolutionary nationalists, arguing that the fight for national independence was integral to the struggle for socialism. The young lords also believed that independence could not be attained through electoral means, but only through revolution. They declared themselves the children of Puerto Rico's Nationalist Party of the 1930s and were the first mainland-raised Puerto Ricans to, as a group, call and organize for the island's independence. The young lords' embrace of independence formed part of the 1960s revival of nationalism among Puerto Ricans with varying levels of political experiences and influences. Encouraged by the Cuban Revolution in 1959 and the gathering pace of the Black freedom movement in the United States, elements of the Puerto Rican left on the island, which had been forced underground by government repression, reconstituted themselves as the Movimiento Pro Independencia. In 1964, Movimiento Pro Independencia opened branches in New York and Chicago, attracting small numbers of older, first-generation Puerto Rican migrants. In the late 1960s, the politics and activism of the young lords, which had developed independently of the island, and mainland independence movements widened the terrain of independence politics among a new generation of mainland-born Puerto Ricans. They educated other 1960s activists about the language discrimination and racism endured not just by Black Americans, but also by Puerto Ricans on the U.S. mainland, and popularized the call for Puerto Rican independence among them. The New York Young Lords formed part of a cohort of young working-class people, and people of color among them in particular, whose unprecedented access to higher education sharpened their latent critique of society and afforded them an infrastructure for dissent. The post-war era's exponential increase in college enrollment delayed the responsibilities of work and family among the young for the first time in U.S. history and simultaneously opened up a space where they could question society. The movements they built challenged racism, the U.S. war in Vietnam, and the oppression of women, gays and lesbians, and the transgender community. They also challenged what many believed were old, soul-slaying social norms and standards of behavior that constrained personal freedoms in the United States. Known collectively as the New Left, these diverse movements were built by a generation whose activism radically changed the cultural and political landscape of the United States. Its participants referred to the overlapping movements of the New Left as the movement. These movements are historically significant because together they established contemporary standards of interactions among Americans and between American people and their government. They challenged white supremacy, made racism unpopular, changed the relationship between white people and people of color, and influenced U.S. foreign policy and the ways the nation understood issues of gender and sexuality. Although the New Left is popularly understood as predominantly white and campus-based, its origins are rooted in the intrepid and morally righteous sit-ins and radical campaigns of the youth wing of the civil rights movement that cohered in April 1960 with the emergence of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. In the North, the Black Panthers and the Young Lords recast SNCC community organizing strategy. The temperament of their protests and worldview gave shape and meaning to the radical style and politics of the New Left. Built by young people of color in cities like Oakland, Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia, these movements were university-incubated and deployed to poorer communities. And like the white student-led sector of the New Left, the seeds of these movements were also sown in the post-war years. They developed in response to the poverty produced by the flight of industries to the suburbs, which in turn created a class of permanently unemployed and discouraged young workers of color, an unprecedented development in modern urban history. The politics of the young lords were driven by a search for root causes. They also were colored by a disdain for liberalism, an exploration of the broadest possible meaning of liberation, and the call for the transformation of both society and the individual. Like others of their ilk, the young lords broke new ground. They uncovered the psychological impact of racism on the oppressed, challenged sexism and homophobia in their ranks, exposed the character of racial oppression in the North, including and beyond that of Black Americans, interpreted the standing of the racially oppressed with a colonial frame, fostered solidarity among all racially oppressed groups in the United States, popularized socialist ideas in communities in which they were active, and raised the standard of accountability in local government. The young lords represent one of the most creative and productive expressions of the New Left, and while the group's rise was influenced by all the movements, the young lords are first and foremost heir to the Black Power movement. The term Black Power had been used in the past, but in 1966, when articulated by Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee leader Stokely Carmichael, it signaled the growing dominance of a more militant political current long embraced by movement people, North and South. It was emboldened by continued white violence against Black Americans and their continued exclusion from the political, social, and economic fabric of their society, despite the passage of civil rights legislation in 1964 and 1965. Black Power was above all a declaration of the right to self-determination, the right of Black people to control and influence their lives and their world. Before long, a broad cultural and political movement cohered around the concept, which variously came to mean the right to armed self-defense against white racist violence, Black pride, and the development of independent Black political leadership free from pressures to accommodate the interests of Northern white liberals. The broad appeal of Black Power allowed for its use among a wide range of actors with differing political agendas who embraced a broad spectrum of solutions to racial oppression. Black Power connected with the rebellious mood of an ethnically diverse set of racially oppressed people in the 1960s because it called on them to embrace the best of their history, laid down socially imposed notions of racial inferiority, exert control over the institutions that governed and oppressed their lives, and see themselves as the architects of a new world. As the Black Power movement reclaimed culture, language, and history for one of the most racially subjugated groups in American history, it inspired a cultural renaissance among Puerto Ricans as well as among Asians, Mexicans, and Native Americans. Black Power enabled Americans of all shades to redefine their political relationship to the nation and to negotiate that often fraught relationship from a position of strength. In the process, however, the color of the Black Power movement and the civil rights movement more broadly was changed as well. Overview of the book. This book tells the story of the rise and fall of the New York chapter of the Young Lords organization, later renamed the Young Lords Party, and of how the Young Lords and so many others of their generation came to believe in the concept of revolution. Chapters 1 and 2 explore the social and economic forces that shaped the lives of young people of color in the post-war city and laid the seeds of their radicalization in the era of civil rights and Black power. Chapter 1 traces the origins of the Young Lords as a Chicago gang. Through the early life experiences of the group's famed leader, José Chacha Jimenez, the chapter examines how the mass dislocation of Puerto Ricans occasioned by federal housing policy forced them to settle in densely populated blocks on the edges of hostile.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?